Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about families, and I know we've talked about this in past classes through our ethical scenarios. So some of this is going to be maybe just a supplement. Hopefully, it won't be repetitive, but I'll try and skip over the repetitive stuff if there is any, and then the rest will just be a value add to hopefully bring a little bit of clarity. A couple of things I want to say is that some of the feedback that I've been getting from some of you are that this ambiguity stuff and the lack of clarity and the lack of really straightforward answers is kind of obnoxious. And I'm really, I don't know if sensitive is the right word, or just acknowledging and understanding of that. And at the same time, our task here is to be able to handle all of this ambiguity and take in all these different unique situations, which have gotten really messy over the last decades of doing this kind of work. And so all of the ethics and all the regulations and all the rules are not there to like overly prescribe what the right kind of way to practice is, but give some guidance. But they're just, given the complexity of what we're working with, there's so many different nuances that we have to navigate. And we don't want people to lose that flexibility and the ability to adapt and adjust to different situations by over-regulating. I don't know if anybody cares about politics at all, but these are the national conversations that we get to hear about from the outside about regulating some other industry or other professions or whatever. And that now we're talking about this one specific one. We see how there's this interest in regulating some, but not too much. And this is politics in action, right? It's making rules that apply to everybody so we can keep people safe and give guidance to people so we can make good, sound decisions, and yet not stifling too much creativity and innovation, or in the context of our work, the nuances that people need to practice in different ways. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to kind of make a comment about that because I know it can be overwhelming for a lot of us. One of the things I said to Mickey just recently in a reflection quiz, which I just wrote. So Mickey, you haven't seen it yet at the time of recording, but you will have seen it by the time you hear this probably. That our job so often is not to provide answers for people, but to build tolerance for coping with the ambiguity or the difficulty of life. And so much of life is just heavy and hard and difficult, and we have lack of direction in what we're supposed to do with the people we have in it, or the directions we're going in life. And our goal is to be able to cope with it and deal with it in ways that are positive and healthy, not to make more clarity, but to be able to make our own choices and move forward with those, even despite the chaos that's going on around us. That's our task here. It's a very important task, and I can't make it less difficult. What I'm trying to do is not to overly prescribe to you, this is how you should do it. These are the answers that you should take away from the class. This is what you need to do or who you need to be. Because then some of you are going to get out and be like, well, that's not how this works in my area of the world. And so it's a little tricky. But anyway, that's the task. Just trying to acknowledge that I'm not going to make it any easier for you, kind of, because it's inherently a challenging thing, and that's our job to figure that out. Okay, so let's jump into families and talk about family circumstances. So for those of you that are going to be interested in doing the MFT license, this is some information that will help you. However, many of you are going to work with families in one context or another. Even if your client is an individual, one little part of that family, it's helpful to think about these family dynamics. And we've already been doing this in class. So again, some of this might be repeat. But just know, and I think you know this already, that there are two different codes of ethics. We have our ACA code of ethics, and then we have I'm going to click on this link actually because I want to look at it really quickly with you guys. There's the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. They have their own. Please click. There we go. I think it's working. My computer's kind of slow today for some reason. They have their own code of ethics, which is a completely different profession, which if we get to talk about this in class, this might make a little bit more sense. But the completely separate code of ethics is not the same as the ACA code of ethics. And this is the really hard part about getting a dual license for those of you that are interested in this. You have to follow both the ACA code of ethics and the MFT code of ethics. And the way you do that is by understanding what your specific role is. If you're working specifically with a family and you're working within the modality of family therapy, which means like using systems theory, using those the methods that an MFT would typically use, then you're kind of wearing the MFT hat and you're following the MFT guidelines. At the same time, if you're a therapist, if you're a counselor doing the counseling profession work and you're seeing families, you might still be using those the systems theory and understanding families in that context. But if you only carry the one license, then you're doing it in the counseling profession context. It's a really hard thing to sort of tease out which one you're doing and which hat you're wearing at any given time. But that's the challenge if you get dual licensure. If you just want one license, you can still do family therapy in either way, but you only have to follow one code of ethics. Okay. So the reason that I have this other code of ethics up here, not to completely, come on, please work. Okay, my computer's not working. I'm trying to drag over the other window, but for some reason Chrome is just being super slow. But what this is the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors. This is part of the ACA. This is not nationally the Marriage and Family Therapy Association of the United States, which this is a national, the top one is a national organization. But the International Association means there are guidelines that people from America can use as they're working overseas. Okay, so it can be really complicated once you start blending all these different kinds of regulations of which one do you follow at which given time. So just know that there is guidance if you're a counselor in the counseling profession, the one that we're getting licensed for, on how to do this marriage and family therapy stuff. But that's completely separate from the separate profession of MFT. It'd be like saying, do you follow the social work code of ethics? Well, no, because you're in a counseling program learning to be a counselor. Do you follow a psychology code of ethics? No, because you're a counselor, you follow the ACA code of ethics. So here I go, confusing you with too much information probably, but this is sort of the way things work. Which one do you follow and which one provides guidance for you and that kind of stuff. So we can answer more questions of how you do that if you choose to get dually licensed. But I'll spare you from that, but at least wanted you to have the links here. One of the unique and specific differences from individual counseling to family counseling is you view the whole family as the client, okay? And that's, I think oftentimes one of the reasons it makes us so challenging is our laws are set up so that we can parse out individual responsibility. Which individual is responsible for whatever it is, custody, for ownership, over property, over, like all that kind of stuff. We definitely have more, our legal system is more focused on individual people or individual entities. But the family as the client is kind of a different thing because you have to understand that there are different branches or different parts to it too. So that's sort of inherently the challenge of who do you serve if you're working with families? Is it one specific person or is it the entire family unit? It also creates challenges with billing and who pays for things and that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's what we're trying to understand here. So what else do I want to say about this? I think I've already mentioned both of those bullet points there. We work within a system that really understands individual people. Okay, please go. All right, this might not work. I might have to stop the recording here and hold on. We're going to do the nuclear option. There we go. Control-Alt-Delete when all else fails. Okay, there we go. I think I fixed it. I'm going to leave this up because I've had to do this a number of times today. So let's talk about the different kinds of families. I bet most of us have some conception of what we think families are, and yet there are so many different arrangements for who's a part of the core unit. So let's take a step back from what we consider the family. Some of us have an idea of families of, a mom, a dad, 2 kids, and, a brother and sister, 1 dog, and a white picket fence, and, that kind of stuff. And that's the sense of a nuclear family. But then we have single parent households. We have biological kids with step parents, 2 sets of biological kids with step parents, like multiple moms, multiple dads. We have aunts and uncles who do a lot of the child rearing, grandparents too, who might be living in the house, or even if they're not living in the house, they're doing a lot of the spending time with kids and sort of raising the kids, even when mom and dad are at work or on drugs or whatever the thing is that takes them away from their parenting duties. Sometimes close friends are living in the house and also kind of co-regulating. That's a bad term to use in this context. Co-parenting in terms of establishing rules and following through with expectations and that kind of stuff. There's gay and lesbian couples raising kids, which has nothing to do with like who's the authority, but like sort of, two moms and two dads just changes dynamics a little bit. And there's just tons and tons of different arrangements. So one thing I'm going to challenge us to do here is not think about the legal definitions of what a family is and not be overly prescriptive of what families do, but think of the family in terms of where are the hearts connected? Like who's an important player in this game? Who's the important character in the story? When we think about how our hearts view the people in our lives and who's important to us, that gives us a whole different perspective on how a family works and who's in it and who's not. So even though you might have a parent at home, a parent who is legally has custody over you as a child, if one parent is the one that spends all the time with you and that you go to when you have issues and it's a safe place for you, that gives a different perspective on where are the bonds, where are the attachments being made. And so we can think of this in a couple ways. One, as I hold up my hands like we've done in class throughout the whole year, there's the therapeutic sense of family. In other words, where are the bonds, where are the attachments, who are the primary caregivers? And there's the legal sense of family, which is all this stuff above here too. So we'll think about this in both of these different contexts. So what are some of those unique challenges? If you have two parents and they bring a child to therapy, or if they bring everybody to therapy, if they're working as couples, if they're working as an entire family with kids, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But who gives consent? Who is identified as the client? And the reason this is kind of a question even, because we love to just say like, well, it's the family, the whole family unit is the client, right? Well, when we're working within a system that doesn't really understand that, it doesn't appreciate that, we have to say either the mom, the dad, or one of the moms, one of the dads, whatever, whoever's sort of making the phone calls and facilitating getting into therapy is usually the one who's kind of like the identified client in terms of billing, something like that. If you're not sure if both people are coming in willingly together, then that's just a conversation that you get to have with somebody. Oftentimes that happens in advance to you even seeing them, like if you're working at an agency. The person at the front desk will kind of answer all those questions. But sometimes if you're working in a private practice and you have to have that conversation, then you get to say, well, I'm going to bill dad and make a diagnosis for dad. But, really what we're going to do is arrange this so we're all working together, something like that. There can be a pressure to engage in family work. Oftentimes one person initiates the coming into counseling, but one of the things that I've seen over the years in talking with people is you say like, okay, here's a scenario, just like we do in this class. Here's a scenario, and we're going to talk through this. And what else do we need to know? And what's the ideal way to handle this situation? One of the things that happens a lot when we're talking about individuals is, well, it'd really be nice if husband would come in. It'd be nice if I could get the teacher's perspective. It'd be nice if I knew from all these different perspectives. And what that's really doing is trying to think in terms of a whole system, because it's really hard to do work with just an individual when you need to hear another person's perspective, or you prefer to hear another person's perspective. And then you get that perspective and you're like, oh boy, this complicates things a little bit too. Am I working here for this client, or am I here for the the relationship to get better, something like that. And that's especially true when you have kids. What right do kids have to refuse therapy? If they're the property and parents have ownership over them, can kids deny getting therapy? That's a question you have to answer for yourself when you're out there. If a kid comes in and says, like, I'm not going to talk to you, my mom made me come here and I'm absolutely not going to do this, I'm mad at her and I don't have anything against you, or maybe I have a ton against you, I don't even know you, but this is you sort of figuring out how much do you push, how much do you, can you do an adequate assessment or something like that? So that's something you get to figure out. What I will say, in an effort to be as clear and distinct as clear as possible, is that kids do have a right to refuse to talk. You can't make anybody talk, right? And that's okay. That just gives you information. If you need information, that's plenty of it in there to read into what's really going on here. If the kid's not going to talk, I'm not going to waste a bunch of time sitting there just making them uncomfortable. what I might do is talk to mom and say, well, how can we then do work to help facilitate an environment in which this kid feels more comfortable to talk or something like that. So these are the adjustments that we have to make. Hopefully you're getting some understanding that you have a lot of power and a lot of authority to do these arrangements in lots of different ways. Okay. Oh, that's not helpful. What if one adult refuses to consent? Well, that's not a whole lot different from a kid refusing, but if one adult refuses to consent, then it just turns into individual therapy. It's not really a whole lot to talk about there, but it can create some unique situations. Sometimes you'll have one person who's really motivated to make changes and another person who's really not. And if we are working for the whole family unit, then it creates these strange expectations where one spouse will say, well, I'm ready to change, or even a kid or whatever, it doesn't matter. But one person will say, I'm ready to change. I'm really ready to do my part, but I don't see that this other person is. And it puts you in kind of a strange situation of like, well, do I work for the whole unit or do I work with this one person to, make changes on behalf of everybody else? So it gets really tricky. One thing I'll tell you, if I haven't told you this already, one of my professors in school, he told me this really interesting analogy. I think it was a professor. Maybe I heard it somewhere else. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. But being from the northern Minnesota area, canoeing is a normal thing that a lot of people do. And I think in Wisconsin here, it's still kind of a normal thing too. But if you've ever sat in a canoe with multiple people, you know how tippy they can be and how much sort of an imbalance in one spot can throw other people off. So imagine you got 3 or 4 people in a canoe and everybody's kind of going about their business, paddling or just sitting there watching, whatever. And all it takes is one person to shift their weight and everybody else has to brace themselves and adjust, right? And the analogy here is that if one person starts to kind of lean over to one side of the canoe, what does everybody else have to do? Well, they have to lean the opposite direction, right? To compensate, because there has to be equilibrium. And that term, equilibrium, is just think balance. All families have some sort of arrangement where equilibrium exists. And when one person tries to change, that upsets the former equilibrium, and everybody braces themselves and has to settle into this new thing. In other words, if one person leans over this way, everybody else, or at least one other person, has to lean over this way. And so when you think of expectations of family system change, if one person all of a sudden says, well, all this dysfunction is just not working, we're all leaning in these weird directions and it's making us uncomfortable, so I'm going to get healthy, and they go straighten up, well, what's going to happen? The whole boat's going to flop over, right? So when one person does change, it changes everything. And in a perfect world, what happens is one person changes little increments of adjustment, giving other people the ability to upright themselves. However, that doesn't always happen, because when you get really comfortable leaning over to the side in your own form of dysfunction and someone else tries to make some changes, what happens? Well, people get mad at the person who's moving. They get mad at the person, even if it's for the best possible, healthiest possible reasons. They seem like the enemy who's just creating an imbalance in homeostasis, or the imbalance in the equilibrium. So you get these weird situations where one person is really motivated and wants to make change, and yet the whole thing can't handle all of that healthy change all at once, which is a big deal, right? I'm not going to say anything more about this one right now, but cooperating with resistant family members, you can probably assume in the analogies that I've given that some people are going to say, even if I really want to change and I want to be the best that I can be, there's still some resistance because I've gotten so comfortable with my position of leaning over and compensating in the other direction, in the canoe analogy, right? So it doesn't mean that people are resistant because they're bad or they want to stay stuck or they're unhealthy. It might mean that they just don't know another way, and they're not really trusting enough that if they lean in, the other person's going to compensate at the same time, right? So that's oftentimes what couples work looks like, is how do we both understand how much we're leaning and trust the other person that little bit by little bit, we're going to upright this ship and be able to sit upright together one day. And then, of course, communicating to people that everybody's an important part of this. That's why I really like this canoe analogy, because if one person feels like they're not being addressed or they're not moving with the family unit, then it still puts stress on the whole thing, right? Oftentimes parents are a little bit more in the know and have capacity to make changes, and yet that's not always true. Sometimes it's the kids who say, I don't deserve this, I want better, and the parents feel like they're ostracized because of for some reason, and they're mad at the therapist for encouraging the child to do some healthy things, whatever, you know what I mean? So it can come from anybody, but having conversation with people about what your intentions are is extremely important in these cases, because you want everybody to know that they're an important part of the process, right? So if that's possible, it's not always possible, but it's ideal. There are a lot of techniques out there. I think it seems like, for the most part, the stuff that you read in textbooks and sort of the established techniques are pretty foundational and fundamental. But there are some theories that use prescriptive interventions that can be challenging. And the book brings up a couple of them. I don't know that I'm as I don't know, bent out of shape is the right word, but I don't know that I'm as nervous about these kind of things. And it might be that this isn't my core type of training, and I don't know as much about these. But I know there are some unique and historically challenged ideas of different kinds of modalities. So here's one, just for sake of example. This is kind of like reverse psychology. It's called paradoxical directives. In other words, if kids think they know what's best for them, like a parent comes in and says, I can't get my teenager to listen to me. I have good guidance because of the way I was raised or the things I've learned or whatever. And you're like, yeah, actually, you're right. You do have a lot of good things to say, but the kid doesn't want to hear them. And so paradoxical directives means, for example, letting the kid take on the parental role. When my son was younger, we used to do this thing, which he still holds it to us to this day. And I still think it's not a terrible idea, but we would say, his name's Ollie. We would give him these coupons at Christmas or birthday, and we'd say, okay, this is an Ollie day, which means Ollie gets to set the rules. Ollie gets to, within reason, Ollie gets to make decisions about what we do and what we eat, and, developmentally appropriate for his age. Doesn't mean he can run out into traffic. Doesn't mean he gets to play video games all day, but we let him kind of make some decisions. What that does is oftentimes kids think they want something or they can handle a responsibility. And so if the kid wants to choose what's for dinner, then we say, okay, let the kid choose what's for dinner. And then he eats a bunch of candy and he gets a stomach ache and decides, oh, okay, so maybe not all my decisions are good ones, right? So there is something to be said for giving people responsibilities and letting them decide what are their own limits, because sometimes in families we can get overly prescriptive and overly restrictive, and to combat that, parents are like, no, I just don't want them to get hurt. I don't want that. I want them to be the best they can be, or I don't want to put so many rules on them because I don't think that my parents did that to me and that's not good. And then you show that parent and that child the alternative to that. And sometimes it can help parents get sort of unstuck or unrigid or something like that, or build in structure amidst their chaos. And other times it can help the kid realize, like, oh, I'm not ready to handle this kind of responsibility or something like that. Another example of this is partners switch duties. Oh, you think it's so easy to be a stay-at-home mom? Well, why don't you stay at home for a little bit and see how that goes for you? You know what I mean? These aren't always practical, and sometimes they can end up just really backfiring, which is why we call them risky techniques. So if you're going to do this kind of stuff, some people have done it to some success, and other people have just really abhorrently resisted that kind of thing because of the outcomes, because of the potential for damage to be done. So, for what it's worth, just know that there's some extra risk there. Another thing is psychodrama or family sculpting. Some of these involve a little bit more touch and physical stuff in our more trauma-informed world now. I don't know if these are still popular or have become less popular. I don't really have a good sense of that. But one thing to be aware of is if you're going to engage in these things that almost borderline on like improv kind of sessions. I just heard another one on a podcast, and I realize I'm cutting off in mid-sentence, but I just heard another one on a podcast where somebody was doing a lot of like let's say you have to have a conversation that you're nervous about and they want to do some rehearsal. There's nothing wrong with practicing a conversation, but in the midst of those rehearsals, this person in the podcast was like feeding and almost grooming people to say things in a certain way, to take a certain perspective. And family sculpting it can be seen kind of like that. It can be done really well, and there's also a sense that it's not, nothing wrong with it, but sometimes it can involve physical touch in a way that make people uncomfortable, or I don't know. It's like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a big theatrical kind of person, or I'm not really good at dancing or performing like plays or something. I've always wanted to. Someday I'm going to be in a dance performance at a community college or like a theater or something, whatever, just to push myself outside of a comfort zone. But nevertheless, there are these risks that come along with it too. So the book does a much better job of describing what those are. One of the other inherent risks too, and this has a lot more to do with your theoretical perspective, but one of the things that has sort of fundamental part of our psychology from back in the 1930s to 50s or something like that was that the psychotherapist or the psychoanalyst is like a third-party observer that doesn't interject into the psyche of another person. You're there as an observer to sort of peer into that psyche and understand what's going on in there, but in the same way that scientists sort of make double-blind research studies so that they can't possibly bias the results. Well, psychology used to be like that, and most of the theories and the modalities of doing therapy were kind of like, we don't get involved in this. And yet family therapy is so much of, no, there is this family system with mom, dad, 2 kids, whatever, and then the therapist comes in and you can't help but having an influence. And so if you can't help but having an influence, then you come in and you say, well, my presence is going to be medicine in this relationship, and I'm going to sit in this canoe, to use the analogy. I'm going to sit in this canoe, and just so that dad doesn't have to work so hard when mom balances, I'm going to do some of that balancing for us, and I'm going to help right the ship. What that looks like in a family therapy session is often I'm going to think about the rules and the expectations, some of them unspoken and some of them people live by, but they don't really understand. And I'm going to help change those rules bit by bit. And I'm going to show you, demonstrate a relationship that looks a little bit different, then ask you guys to try it. So you work with me, through them, it's kind of triangulation. But then once we figure it out, then you guys unassisted take over and you get to sort of function while I back out, something like that. So sometimes therapists take a more traditional approach and don't want to get quite as involved and sort of give information to let people try. And other times therapists step in and say, I can't help but be involved in the system. And I'm going to use that to the family's advantage, something like that. That's a kind of a style question. The equivalent in individual therapy is somebody who's like, I'm going to do cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm going to look at your thought patterns, your belief system, your behaviors that happen outside and inside the session. And then I'm going to comment on those and give you some strategies and like talk to you about how you can change you. But it's a very hands-off approach, kind of. Other people are more sort of feminist in their approach, not in the woman power sense, but in the sense that we're all involved in these hierarchical systems of power and order and structure, and we can't help living in this same world together. So I'm not going to pretend that I don't have an influence in your life. I'm just going to own it and be a part of it. And so there are different perspectives or different strokes for different folks. And so you guys get to decide, like, how do I want to be involved in this relationship, and how much do I want to be kind of dislocated from it, and how much am I just going to get in there and be involved in it? Those are just personal choices that you get to make that I can't determine for you. I can tell you stories about kind of how I do this with people and what that looks like for me and the kind of choices that I make, but that may not be right for all of you. I won't tell you too many of those right now, but one thing I will say is that I tend to like to get more involved and just own my place in the family. It feels to me like it puts a lot more responsibility on me to be on and to do well and to make good choices and to be really present with the family when I'm more involved. But I don't think I can dislocate myself enough to where I feel comfortable, because once I do, I feel like I'm not really doing the best service for them. In other words, I say, okay, consider me sort of an intermediary for those times that you're having a discussion at home and everybody's like a breakdown fighting, and say, if you have to say, well, Aaron talked to us about this. Remember when we set that expectation that we wouldn't have this conversation until we can do it together because we both agreed that we can't function in the midst of conflict? In that sense, they're bringing me up when they're at home, and that means that I'm still a part of their system, even though they're not in session with me. And I'm okay with that to a degree, right? As long as I'm not requiring them to do weird stuff or to like being manipulative, and there's a risk of that. But anyway, we can talk more in a specific scenario some later. Even systems theory itself, which most of you have heard that term, has been criticized with certain situations like abusive relationships. In other words, if the therapist is supposed to get involved in this system and not take sides and treat the family unit as a cohesive thing, does that mean if one person is being kind of a butthead and I was sorry, I got distracted. I was seeing if the captions would actually translate the word but, because you can set this up so it doesn't spell out the swear words. But if I say butthead, it's going to say it above, and I think it's funny. So sorry, the fifth grader in me had to giggle at the whatever. Maybe it's not that I'm immature. Maybe it's that I have an 8-year-old at home, and we have all kinds of what's the right way to say it? Scatological conversations, because he still thinks that butt cheeks are the funniest thing in the world. So anyway, sorry, I digress. So is it inappropriate for, let's say in a domestic violence situation, an abuser, for me to not help advocate for one person? And there are those situations in which one person is being abusive. The question is, do we call that out? Or do we not take sides and say, well, but they got a point here. You're being a little bit passive, and now they're calling you names, and yeah, you should stand up for yourself. But this is a good way for us to learn these things, or you know what I mean? There are some situations that they don't fit that kind of model. And so as much as I like to be getting involved in the family and being a part of their process and treat them as a family unit, there are times in which you have to step out of that and say, I'm gonna take a pause here and protect this person, because something about this is unhealthy enough for me to want to interject in a way that really changes the whole thing. To use the canoe analogy, if someone in the front of the canoe is just flailing back and forth and the other person is like absolutely unstable to the point where they're going to fall out, this is when you grab the person in the back with your life jacket and say, okay, we're going to float together, because that person is going overboard and taking everybody else with them, So is that imposing our values on the client? I mean, yeah, kind of, but kind of not too. It's not necessarily imposing values, but it certainly interjects bias, and it threatens the cohesive unit of the family. And so whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is worth discussion. And what point in which you step in and say, I'm going to protect this one person over the other is a conversation to be had in the circumstances that you're in. So confidentiality can get kind of tricky. In other words, who gets to know what in these situations? Confidentiality can't be guaranteed in groups, and it can't be guaranteed in families either. And you have the same conversation of what happens here stays here, and you can't guarantee that. And so I like the phrase, nothing about me without me. In other words, if you're going to have this conversation, have it with me at home, like with the partner, with the kids or whatever, or have it in session with a therapist. But don't go to your friends and talk about your wife and that kind of stuff. And that brings up a whole conversation of how much are we allowed to vent to our girlfriends or guy friends or whatever it is. But still, it's just not really a healthy environment to be triangulating too much. And by triangulating, I mean, if I have an issue with you, but I go talk to somebody else about it, I'm not really having the conversation that I should be having, right? In a perfect world. So, confidentiality problem. Also, privileged communication can't be guaranteed in couples and families counseling either. In other words, all that stuff that we talked about with individuals. Remember in our first slide when we said the law is set up to understand individuals as responsible units, and we can be private for that one person, but the same thing isn't necessarily true in the same way of working with families. I think these kind of things are some of what family and couple therapists, some people shy away from it because they're like, oh, it's too messy, it's too complicated. I don't want to get involved in that. And here's the crappy part of this, or it's not crappy, I guess, but it's like difficult. Here's the difficult part of this, is that to treat the family as an important thing is important because there's a lot of stuff that you can do with a family unit that you can't do with an individual. You can't help correct family problems with just one person. In other words, you can't talk to a person about balancing that canoe without talking to the rest of them and saying, here's what's we're going to try and do as we're uprighting, right? One person wants to get healthy. Everybody else gets mad. They don't understand why this person is sitting upright in the canoe after years of leaning. It's hard to do that way, right? And so there are important things about family, and it brings in all these legal risks because of the way our legal system is set up with. Okay, so like high risk, high reward, you can think of it maybe that way. I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding or misrepresentation, but there's something about that that's real. Okay. Another question: should counselors hold secrets for individual family members? Yeah, I mean, there are a couple options. One of them is, yes, it encourages more honest and open feedback. In other words, we've talked about this briefly in past classes where sometimes you have a family that comes in together and you say, okay, I want to spend a little bit of time with wife and husband and kid. So individually, and then the husband says, oh, here's a little bombshell. Nobody else knows this. And you're like, okay, well, I have to hold that now and manage that while, I'm talking to kids and the mom or something like that. And that encourages more honest feedback to separate the family out. Some people say to this next point, they say, no. We don't want to get wrapped up in that triangulation thing and have to hold those secrets for individual members because it puts us in a really precarious spot. So we're just going to keep everybody together. And this is kind of the space where you have to see somebody do it and get some supervision to sort of see how other people handle things, and then decide if that's the best fit for you and if you want to handle those various different contexts, because there's pros and cons either way. The moral of the story is be guided by do no harm, and harm can happen, and that's okay. In other words, as people start rocking the boat, you might get wet, and that doesn't mean that it's a whole complete dysfunction. It's your fault. There's a way to really step in and do the wrong thing, but more often than not, you're just going to be doing a lot of shaking while you're in that canoe and you're working in that family, and people are going to get upset with each other and maybe you if you're part of it now. And yet, explain your intentions, talk about why you're doing the things you're doing, set those expectations clearly and continuously, and most of the time you're going to be totally fine working through these things. And people will understand once they're not mad anymore, or hurt by you or something you did, whatever. We just finished doing our informed consent assignment where you made your own informed consent. So think about these kind of things. If you're going to be doing family and couples work, you can think about how you communicate these kind of things to people, whether it's just verbally in session or whether you're going to put those in your informed consent in writing. So you can talk about what your position is on these. More challenges. There's a different skill set. I think that one probably pretty self-explanatory. Some of you I hear this every semester. Someone's like, I hate doing groups. I don't want to do groups. That's fine. That's fine. It is a different skill set doing group work, and families are no exception to that. Some people are just built for wanting to do this, like, sitting in a room and helping orchestrate, for lack of a better term, to be that orchestra conductor. And getting people to be harmonious and in sync with each other means that beautiful music can be made. In terms of families, like families can work cohesively as a unit. And some people are cut out for that, and some people just don't want anything to do with it, and that's totally fine. There's some overlap between how you can recognize group dynamics and assessing group process in terms of like motivation to change, and what individuals are influencing the group in a way that's helpful or not helpful or something like that. So there's a lot of that overlap. So if you're interested in group stuff, family stuff is kind of an extension of that, or it can be seen loosely in that way. We talked a lot about imposing values on the system. think most of us would look at our code of ethics and say, yeah, that is a bad thing. We don't really want to be imposing our values. We want to let people have their own values. And yet, here's another place where some people say, I'm not going to impose any values and I'm going to take a very hands-off approach. Whereas other people say, you can't help but imposing values. One of my core values is I want people to not be harmed, And so in individual or group work, some people have like a sadistic or masochistic kind of tendencies. And I'm going to say, if you want to continue hurting yourself, that's okay. But I don't know that I can treat you if you're going to be in that place, because my goal is to get you to not hurt yourself, to not be self-sabotaging, that kind of thing. So there are some values, depending on how you look at it, that are inherent in the process. Here's a list of a couple of them. The goal is to stay married. Some people say, I want you guys to be functional and healthy and happy together. And I'm going to do everything I can, because my conception of health in a family or a couple dynamic is for that to work. Other people say, maybe you guys are responsible for whatever choice you want to make. And my job is just to be a sounding board to help you with the skills. And if you need to make that choice to split up, then that's up to you, right? So some people have values that they impose on the clients. And in some ways, that's kind of not all bad, right? If you tell them, like, I'm going to work, if you hear a couple that says, we want to stay married, and I said, well, I'm going to work like crazy to help you stay married then, right? I'm going to assume that's the path going forward unless I hear otherwise. Other people say, I'm not going to influence your choice. It's your choice for you to make it. Some people think that women, traditional family arrangements are too paternalistic, and women, deserve to have more of a voice. Some people say, no, families are all kinds of different arrangements. They do it however the heck they want to. And that can be a real challenge for some of us. Kids should have more freedom. Kids should have more discipline, how you discipline kids, and etc. So there's all kinds of different ways in which we bring in our own baggage to family stuff too. So being aware of that, and know that generally speaking, in most scenarios, and most, I mean like almost all of them, it's not a good idea to impose values. And there's really a way to do this without imposing any values at all. And that might be my bias, but there are some of you that are going to say, no, family unit, this is the way it was in the Bible, and this is how it's supposed to be. And so this is the kind of work I do. And if you want a different kind of therapy, you can go to somebody else. And there is some of that happening in the world. The question is that the best way to go about this? So I don't think it is, personally. And I don't think most counselors would say that it is, because people can still make their own choices. And if you help people get to a healthier place, whatever that healthy place looks like for them, could be a job well done. Not everybody agrees with that, right? But it is what it is. So here's kind of my final phrase, or maybe this is my bias, but I think this is in line with the majority of other couple therapists or people who work with families. Not your role to determine. Oh, crap. Hold on. I can't get myself out of the way because my buttons aren't clicking today, but it's not your role to determine how couples and families should change. Learn how they want to, and help them get there. That's kind of the moral of the story here. So I already mentioned groups, and groups are kind of similar to families. We already kind of said that. Challenges to confidentiality, same thing. We'll skip over that. No privileged communication. That's consistent with what we've already talked about. And for those of you that maybe have forgotten what privileged communication is, that's your ability to hear whatever goes on in the group and maintain that privacy legally. You don't have the same ability to withhold records and that kind of stuff. I don't hear as many people coming out of group situations and being litigious and wanting to make lawsuits and like asking for records and all that kind of stuff. I just don't hear that. But you don't really have a lot of expectation of privacy in group or family work in the same way that you do in individual work. There's still questions about whether parents should be informed about disclosure during adolescent groups. The same kind of stuff applies in terms of like reporting and mandated reporting and that kind of stuff. So there are questions about, can you really expect that for minors? What goes on in group, stay in group? And the answer is generally no. And it's harder to maintain that privacy for individual members if there is a potential risk outside of the session too. So there's something to be mindful of there. I'm not going to list off this whole thing. Just trying to make sure that you can actually see in the bottom there all of the screen, but I'm going to read these really quickly, and you can take a screenshot and zoom in or whatever you have to do here, but this is all in your textbook anyway. Include the following in your informed consent. If you're going to be doing family work, these are some suggestions for that. Sorry, we're talking about group work here, but some of this might apply to family work as well if you want some of that language. What's the purpose of the group? The psychological risks involved in group participation? What services can or cannot be provided within the group setting as opposed to individual services? The division of responsibility between leader and participants? What that looks like? At a very basic level, what I usually tell people is like, you're here to do the work. I'll watch the clock. You don't have to worry about that. I'll manage the time. If somebody's talking too much, you can jump in and ask them to leave space for other members, but that's also my responsibility. And I'm going to do a lot more of that at the beginning until I feel like we're all kind of working together. And once things get up and running and we're working, then you guys can manage that. But it's my job to do that at the beginning to help make sure we get to the right place in terms of everybody feels like they have a safe place here where they can contribute and support and share and all that kind of stuff. So it's some kind of speech like that, but it's usually a little bit extended depending on the kind of group it is. Especially if you're in schools and you're working with kids, in schools, or you're working with kids or you're working with kids, there's a lot more structure and we take on a lot more responsibility there. Rights and responsibilities, confidentiality limits, the ways the group process may or may not be congruent with the participants' cultural values. So in terms of groups are often take on this egalitarian, everybody can participate the same way. And yet some people have cultural values that say older people get to speak first, so they get to talk over younger members, or, people who have been to more schooling should have more power in the relationship, which sometimes that's the group leader, and people afford a lot of power and authority to the group leader, which isn't always that helpful. Sometimes people are like, I'm an attorney, I'm a doctor, and so everybody's like looking up to them for answers, which sometimes can stifle progress. So that's something to pay attention to. And then I'm still in the way here. The freedom to leave the group if it does not turn out to be what the member wants or needs. So those are just some good suggestions to take with you. You also have an entire class on groups, and so I don't need to labor on this, and you probably talk about ethics and that kind of stuff. So there is a link for guidance if you are interested in doing group work. I'm not going to click. I don't think I even can click on it because my computer is being stupid. It's working. I'll tell you what it says as soon as it comes up. Some places have their own policies. Oh, okay, the link doesn't even work. So that you might have to do a Google search for this for documentation. That's all it is. It's just like paperwork. If you need some help with your informed consents or that kind of stuff, it's another resource for you. Some places have their own policies, and so you might have a template to work with. I know that when you guys get to practicum, oftentimes what you're doing is setting up your group and marketing it and trying to get people there and involved in it. And we don't really provide you with any kind of template for what those groups are because there's so many different kinds of groups that you guys set up. So if you're in that position right now and you've set this up, this will make a lot of sense. And you're like, oh boy, I wish I would have had some template to work with. And if you're not there yet, it might be worth asking somebody about their experience with setting up a group to talk about, well, how do you go about doing that? And what resources did you have for you when you were doing it? Groups can be sensitive to how clients leave the group. In other words, remember, we're talking about ethics here. And we're not talking about like clinical skills of facilitating groups. We're talking about ethical situations that get really weird, right? Did the group do something? Is the person okay? Counselors get to help with this, to help process this. It's not all that uncommon for somebody to come to the group leader after a group session or something and say, I thought this would be a good group for me, but I'm really having a hard time with some of the things people are saying. I'm not going to come back anymore. And you as a group facilitator have to ask yourself these questions. Is it appropriate for me to communicate that person's story or the reasons that they're leaving with the other group members, even if they didn't say so? In other words, am I getting myself into a triangulated position by saying, well, they didn't really like what you had to say, and so they left? Because what's that going to do for them if they meet each other at the grocery store? Well, the therapist, Aaron, said that you didn't like me, and I'm a little bit offended by that. And all of a sudden there's a problem ensues, right? And you can't be there to help process through that. And so how you help, what role you take when people leave groups can be a sensitive one. If we bring up specific scenarios, it'll be a little easier for me to give an example of that. I can tell you one that happened the other day that was a little bit opposite to what, or this is like last year, but it was a little bit opposite to the example I just gave, in which case the example I just gave, probably the best solution would be to say, they had some reasons for leaving the group and they chose to leave, but it's under circumstances of their choice. I didn't ask them to leave. This is something that they wanted to do for their own personal reasons, and just leave it at that. Nothing against them or the group or anything. In an other scenario that I experienced last year, a person came to a kind of a group setting. It wasn't a specific therapy group, but it was very similar to one in the way that it was functioning. And they came and they said, disclosed a whole bunch of really personal stuff. And everybody else was like, holy crap, I don't really know how to do this. And I don't know if we're at this place yet. And this person had been to therapy before and done some group work and just had the expectation that all the rest of the group would be able to handle this. And they went up to the facilitator afterwards and said, I feel uncomfortable about having disclosed as much as I did, and I don't know if this is the right group for me. And the facilitator of the group acknowledged that and said, yep, I get that. This is not really a place where we can kind of handle or process through all that same stuff. And it might also make it difficult for the other people in the group to really do things that they need to be doing here. They're here for different reasons. And that person chose to disclose that to the rest of the group, which was a good way to help sort of establish these are the norms. You heard this, and that was unsettling for them and maybe for you guys, but that's not really what this is all about. And so this is a good example of how you can come and go as you need to, and also how I'll help individuals of you decide if this is the right place for you and what is appropriate here and what isn't. So that's a good example of choosing to do a little bit of disclosure and it making sense in that scenario for the person to do that. Okay. I'll keep going. How much more we got? We're at 52 minutes and we got one slide left. I'm actually on time for once. This is great. I get excited about this. So screening, there are some ethical considerations when it comes to screening. There's a typo there. Some members can jeopardize the group. I don't know what that means. I think that he was supposed to be the, and then I had there twice, and it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, some people can jeopardize the group. People who have potential to do harm to others, those who dominate or monopolize time, aggressive or hostile in their approach to others, the states of crisis, acute psychosis, personality disorders. If you've been through group class, you've likely seen a list like this of people that aren't really appropriate for certain kinds of groups. When you guys are developing your own groups, you probably have either a theme or a specific diagnosis, or sometimes they're like, a women's only group or cancer survivors group, or all kinds of different things in which it's appropriate to keep to protect the group in such a way that keeps it functioning. The ethical situation here is if we have the requirement to do no harm and you want people to actually make progress, there are either certain kinds of people or certain environments where it actually can do more harm, and it can keep people from making the most progress that they want to make in a group. So making those choices can be uncomfortable for some people, but it really is important that that part of your role as the facilitator or developer of the group is that you protect that unit to be able to do what they need to do in the time that you have with them. Okay. Sometimes that means asking people to leave. Sometimes it means expanding the scope of the group to include other members. So it just depends. I don't want to go too far into this in terms, because there's not quite as much ethical implication, but watch for scapegoating members. Members being pressured, misuse of confrontation, or people feeling attacked, physical injury from group activities. This is like, if you don't have the ability to stand, then don't worry about it. We're not going to get up and do a whole psychodrama where I'm going to have you moving around if you have back pain. You know what I mean? People picking favorites. to me, this seems like more of a clinical question. That if you have people doing that, the question is, do you ask them to leave because they're creating a hostile environment? Or is this quote unquote grist for the mill? Or is this all material that can be useful in processing with the group? Some of that will come from your skill and your competency level, which is the ethical tie-in here. If you can't handle managing that kind of conflict, or this kind of person who's challenging the group in sometimes really healthy ways, then that's a question of your competency. If you have somebody who's really challenging the group in unhealthy ways, then maybe it's a question less of your own competency and more of this person is getting in the way of progress for other people. And deciding whether it's me as a therapist or whether it's them as the person can be a really tricky thing, which is why we go through practice stuff like this and getting practice in your own confidence and imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff, because you don't want to make a mistake there and say like, well, I'm not doing a good job, when really it's not you, it's that person who's pushing people into uncomfortable places, right? And this is where supervision can be so important. And I shouldn't say uncomfortable places where it's just unhealthy and unhelpful. Discomfort's fine, but dysfunction is not fine. If you're forming groups from your own individual clients, consider how clients share your attention. In other words, if people are used to talking to you one-on-one, some people just won't use their own clients in groups at all. Other people think, oh, I have groups and it's almost all my own clients. You know what I mean? But how you do that, if you say, oh, most of you are my clients, and then that kind of outs another person as your individual therapy client, there's an ethical problem there too, potentially. It may be not a problem, but it also might be a problem, depending on how it turns out. The question is, what's our ethical duty to maintain confidentiality? And if you're inviting your own clients, a lot of people take issue with that. Some people don't. It's just sort of, partly it's personal preference, and partly it's the wisdom that we have to use on what the risks are that we're taking here and how it could potentially impact somebody. So, food for thought, right? Here's a nice little quote. Maybe the journey of life isn't about becoming anything. Maybe it's about unbecoming everything that really isn't you, or that isn't really you, so that you can be who you were meant to be in the first place. Kind of a beautiful thing. I don't know how to pronounce that guy's name, but Paolo, I'm not even gonna try it. Cello. I think it's Paolo Cello. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't really know. Someone correct me if you have a better pronunciation of that. But anyway, thanks for sticking with me. And I will talk to you in class. See ya. Okay, the button is not buttoning, so I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I think I'm just going to cancel the program and hopefully it records. Please work.